Okay. So this is CTI 120, Chapter 2, Personal Security. So we talked last time about the nature of security, just kind of getting an intro there, and some different techniques we can use to impose a safer environment for ourselves in the electronic space, both physically as well as logically. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how we as individuals can try and improve security, specifically by our behaviors and by observations. So we're going to talk about weak password criteria, how we define a password as being strong or weak, and ways we can help to mitigate that for ourselves. We're going to describe some attacks that may be committed against passwords that could be used to try and either riddle out what they are or circumvent them entirely. We're going to look at different types of social engineering, basically just using psychological means to try and get information out of people that would allow you to decipher their password or, again, circumvent it. Describing identity theft and the risks of social networking, and some personal security defenses. So the early goals of attacks on computers, the first bits of cyber terrorism, hacking, things like that, was to deface or destroy. People weren't necessarily trying to post things like computer viruses that would then be distributed. They were more so concerned about just trying to spray a big old smiley face on the wall of somebody's building in a virtual sense. Today's attacks, of course, are driven by a slightly different impetus. They're trying to steal information. Information has kind of become a de facto currency. Knowing something that somebody else doesn't know can put you at a sense of advantage. So this kind of information tends to be very popular in circles where procurement of this by legal means is much more rewarding, I guess you would say. Now, this information is often used for financial gain. There are times when people can do it because of ideological reasons or things like that, but generally it's trying to gain money or financial advantage. The attacks that we see today are also directed at a much wider group of users. People don't have to do what we call spear phishing anymore. They can focus on a group of users by means of, putting up a spoofing website or poisoning a DNS server, any number of things like that. And because of the number of devices and operating systems that are out there and how different they all are and how difficult it can be to try and patch all of those things, we talked about that a little bit last week, we will see an issue with trying to keep all of those devices secure. There's a lot of holes. So let's look at some different types of what we call authentication. To authenticate is to verify the ability of somebody, whether or not they're considered to be cleared for access. Authentication that we talk about in like Sec 110. So if you were to take that course, you would be talking about two others as well. Mostly just gesture and location. But that's not something we really worry about as much in here because we're talking more so about the primary forms of authentication, the token, the identity notification, and knowledge. So the token is something that you have, something that you possess. Identity is something that you are, and knowledge is something that you know. So the example they give us in the text is, the example they give us is that a man comes to his health club, parks in the parking lot, locks his car, and goes inside. He goes in and he goes to his locker and goes ahead and puts his street clothes in there, changes into his gym clothes, and goes and does his thing. So the key fob, something that he has, is uniquely paired to his vehicle to be able to remotely lock it. Now, if he were to just use a standard key and lock the door manually, as people used to do, then of course he can be considered still uniquely able to access the vehicle because of the physical key. The Identity item is the desk attendant, basically verifying that the person is a paid member or a verified member of that particular location and allowing them entry. Now, most of the time they will automate this by having a badge or, again, another key fob, something with an RFID tag or something similar to verify who you are. Again, those tend to fall into the token side of the fence, though. And then third, the known combination, a little padlock combination that this person knows allows them to access their locker so that they can store their materials. So again, we've got the three primary pieces. So here we see a visual representation of that. Again, these graphics are always very interesting, but that's the general gist of it. Something you have, something you are, and something you know gives us the three primary modes of access to the three things that we need here. So the primary method of authentication for a computer system is a username and password pair. So we will have an issued username that is given by an administrator, sometimes chosen by the user in question, and then a password, which is, again, sometimes assigned, sometimes generated by the user. So it just depends. This is our primary form of authentication because it's an easy public and private method, what we call asymmetric verification or authentication. So, your username, you type it in. If somebody sees your username, that's not as big of a concern, but if somebody knows both your username and your password, that's much more of a concern. The password is a secret combination of characters that is supposed to be known only to the user. I will say that passwords are a little bit difficult to maintain complexity as well as maintaining privacy. So they're not really considered to be strong defense against attackers. One of the primary advantages that computers have over people is speed and accuracy. So how many times have you been in a hurry and you've mistyped your password and you're sitting there typing it 2 or 3 times going, I know that's the right password. Turns out you're holding shift at the wrong time, or you're hitting a number key instead of a letter, or you don't have numlock turned on if you're on a laptop. There's a number of different things that could be throwing you off. So the fact that human beings are much more inaccurate than machines and definitely do not have the same level of speed means that unless there are certain defenses in place, brute force attacks can allow an automated program to find your password much more quickly. Excuse me. There are several different types of attacks beyond just what we call brute force, and we'll talk about those as we proceed. So this is something that I added in. It's a clip from a comic strip called XKCD. And they do a lot of tech-based stuff that they kind of convert to a much more digestible form. So I'll go through the text first here on the left. Humans can only memorize a limited number of items, and this is something that I learned in like Psych 101 back when I first started out as an undergrad. I can't remember the name for it, but there's a particular number of memorizable items that are easy for human short-term memory to hold in place. That's our buffer, if you will. So it's 7 plus or minus 2. So the plus or minus 7 means it's just above or below 7 by a short range. And again, some people have better memories than others. Some people have slightly worse. So if you ever look at things like your social security number, that's 9 numbers. If you look at your driver's license number, that's probably somewhere between 7 and 10. If you get your phone number, not including the area code, that's 7 numbers. So there's several that are involved that are fairly easy to try and remember. Now, in order to make a password complex, one of the most important things is length, because if we have a number of possible combinations, we have to think about the multiplicity of that particular structure. So if we have the password, hello, that's only 5 characters long. Now, even if we were to have the numbers 0 through 9, the letters A through Z, both upper and lower case, then we have something like 62 characters. Now, granted, 62 to the 5th power is a pretty large number. But if we were to do an extra character, hello X or something like that, then that becomes 62 to the 6th power. And then if we add the complexity of adding special characters such as particular symbols or punctuation, so things like the home row on your keyboard, exclamation point, the @ sign, the pound sign, etc. That, of course, increases the complexity again. Let's say 70, just to be round, as opposed to 72. And then we start adding a length requirement. Not just that we have to have a complexity of the password. Let's say that we have to have at least one uppercase character, at least one lowercase character, a number, a special character, does not allow spaces, blah, 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 blah. But it has to be at least 8 characters long. 8 characters is not an uncommon length requirement. Anything to the 8th power, once you go past, let's say about 3 or 4, starts getting really, really huge. So the longer the password is, the harder it is to memorize, and the more complex it is, the harder it is to memorize. And the recommendation, of course, is that you should not use the same password for more than one account. Granted, I don't know anybody who hasn't done this at some point or doesn't still do this today. It's not recommended, of course, but it's very difficult to find reasons not to do that. People will take shortcuts, people will take the same password, and then maybe change one thing about it, change a number, capitalize a different letter, something like that. On XKCD, they had this really interesting exploration of this. So we can see the comic on the right. Let's look at the first panel, top left. They use a misspelling of, well, it's not misspelling, it's an alternate spelling of troubadour. Sometimes you will see it's D-O-U-R as opposed to D-O-R. It's a non-gibberish base word, and it's uncommon. The order of the special characters is not known. There are some easy substitutions that can be made for letters like O, which can be substituted for 0, 4 for an A. What we call leet speak happened a lot online during the days, like when I first started playing online games like Ultima. Ultima Online, there was a lot of stuff like that. RuneScape had that a lot. There was also reference to lower than upper, alternating. Of course, there's a couple of different things we can have there that allow complexity to become more extensive. So the idea is that here we have a couple of different what are called bits of entropy. Entropy, of course, meaning disorder in a system. So if we look at the combinations of what they've got here, we've got what looks to be like 16 on the base word, 1 variation for caps, 3 for common substitutions, 3 for numerals, 4 for punctuation, 1 for order unknown. So if we add all that together, that comes up to 28 different bits of entropy that are generated. So if we have 2 to the 28th power, that gives us roughly 3 days at 1,000 guesses per second. And what the on a weak remote web server, the difficulty to guess would be considered easy. This is a relatively small amount of possible guesses that the machine would have to go through. Now, generally, what we see is not an online cracking process. That is a very bad idea because there's a lot of monitoring involved. Instead, what they'll do is they'll steal what's called a digest, which is essentially a processed version of the password that can be stored, which when run through an algorithm, the original password will produce this variation, and it will produce the same variation each time. So that it doesn't have to store the original password, but it does have a method of verification. In the top right corner, it talks about why it's difficult to remember whether or not you're using the right word, where the variation was, whether or not you had a common substitution or not, especially if it's an inconsistent substitution. If we look at the top left frame again, you'll see that the first O is substituted for a 0, but the second O is not. So again, you could transpose that in your head very easily. So this is not something that's easy to remember for a human being in general. Now, if we were to use something more like the bottom left frame, where we have correct horse battery staple. Now, this is assuming that we have a slightly uncommon non-gibberish base word, all lowercase, no caps. Then we can say that we have a level of complexity closer to 11 bits per term, so we have 4 of those packages, then we would say, okay, 44 bits of entropy at that point. 2 to the 44 at 1,000 guesses per second goes from the original 3 days at 2 to the 28 to 550 years. Now, part of this is due to the fact that human beings process things a little bit differently. So when we start doubling, we don't think about how extensive this becomes. If you have 10 seconds, that becomes 20 seconds, then 40, then 80. Exponential growth is very, very large. A lot of people who want to use memory strengthening exercises or trying to memorize complex things like digits of pi traditionally use what we call memory palaces, essentially to where they create a narrative in their mind, a story or a physical location that they can then recall more graphically that tells a story or includes some kind of structure that helps them to remember their password. So here in the bottom right corner, they have a horse saying that's a battery staple, and it's a little battery with a staple sitting on it, and then correct is the response. So correct horse battery staple gives us that kind of sequence. Now, if we were to look at the first and fourth panels and try and introduce some of the variations we talked about before, let's say that for each word, after it, we give its length. So after correct, we put 7. After horse, we put 5. After battery, we put 7. After staple, we put 6. Introduction of numerals is 3 bits. Caps, if we capitalized each word, or if we capitalized the second letter of each word, then that, of course, would give us 1 bit. If we added some form of punctuation, that could add some complexity as well. But as we see, rather than the complexity stemming from the funky symbols or substitutions, it's really just the length of the term being the more important item. So again, weak characteristics would be people like to use very common words. They like to use short passwords. PII in a password, that shows up a lot. Personally identifiable information. So if somebody's favorite football team is the Eagles and they like the color blue, or if they have a child that has a birthday in September, or that child's middle name, things that people don't think are easily accessible would then be prime material for trying to insert into a password. So that tends to be a very bad idea. PII is a very big no-no in any kind of corporate password environment. And then, of course, static passwords, to where you don't change the password for a substantial period of time. This table always cracks people up because if we look at, this is just 2014, 2017, the most common passwords as collected by several different security agencies, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Seriously, it's the 21st century. We're almost 2 decades in. We are 2 decades in now, but at the time this survey was written, we were 14 to 17 years in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Unbelievable that it's topped the charts every single year. Now I have to assume that to a degree, this is just people leaving default passwords on systems. We don't know anything really about the collection methods, any biases that were implicit, but the idea that several different studies have yielded pretty similar results definitely says something about the lack of seriousness that people apply to their passwords in this particular instance. And as we go down, we see that some of the similar patterns show up, like the word password at number 4 in 2014, but in 2015, 2017, all the way up to number 2, dipping down to number 8 in 2016. So we see these strings of passwords tend to kind of have their vogues, if you will. Strings of numbers going from 1 up to 9, even including 0, 0 sometimes being at the front, sometimes being at the end. And then people getting very creative and thinking, oh, let me reverse it and go from 9 to 1 instead of 1 to 9. Football, baseball, very common passwords. I love you, rock you, princess. QWERTY, of course, being part of the top row of the keyboard. God, sex, those passwords were fairly common, especially in the 90s. It's something that people don't think about, but the level of complexity of your password, human beings aren't as creative often as they think. So there's only a certain amount of information that tends to be considered private or even semi-private, that people would construct passwords with. People do tend to think very similarly when they're trying to construct something that, oh, it's something I can remember, but not somebody else could remember. But if somebody knows you well enough, they could probably at least take a stab at a guess. So as I said, online guessing is really not used because, again, there's a lot of surveillance going on. There's a lot of lockouts that could occur. You know, if you get the same password wrong more than X number of times in a very short period, they'll go ahead and lock you out. You know, I'm sure you guys have all seen the screenshots of people who have iPhones or iPods or other devices that it's like, this device is disabled, will unlock in like 4,000 minutes or something. iTunes or some other interface that will go ahead and allow you to verify your credentials independently. A digest, as I said, is just a digital representation of the password, but it's not the plain text. It has been converted by means of being passed through usually what's called a hash algorithm. Hash algorithms have a fixed output length, but a variable input length. And that means that no matter how long the input string is, it will put out the same output length no matter what. So let's say that it's always going to be 16 characters. You could put in the entirety of Tolstoy's War and Peace, and you'd get 16 characters, or you could put in, you know, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog and get 16 characters. It's not going to matter. It's not going to give you any indicator of how long the original was because of the length of the output. Now, this digest is a stored file on the target computer, which means that if it is located and it is retrieved, that if the person has enough time and enough ability, they could theoretically try and reverse engineer what the passwords were. Now, there's a couple of different ways that they can do that. They can either run a brute force attack, which is where they try every possible combination to decrypt the information. Now, this takes forever, but it doesn't miss any possibilities. There's also a dictionary attack, which is where they take a library of common words, especially very common words to passwords, like those top 10 lists we saw, and they will go ahead and try and run various hashing algorithms on those common words and see if any matches pop up. So we're going to take a set of dictionary words, and then we may perform what's called salting, which is where we add or alter characters in order to try and make them a would just be astronaut 1 or astronaut 15 or A5 TRONAUT. You know, start doing substitutions for those letters yet again, and then of course being able to reverse strings of characters. So those kinds of substitutions are fairly common. Once these different variations have been generated, like I said, they compare them between the new digest from the known value to the stolen one. So here we can see a visual example of what that would look like, trying to guess what a particular password might be. So again, brute force attacks are much more thorough, but they take a substantial amount of time, because think about what we talked about a couple of slides ago with the bits of entropy. You know, the longer that password is, the more complex the number of possibilities becomes. Eventually it becomes, for all intents and purposes, infinite, but that takes a substantial amount of time in the world of computing to be registered. Something else to think about is that when we're dealing with brute force attacks, we're doing things that don't make any sense. We can sometimes change over a brute force attack by introducing analysis factors, by saying, okay, we know that the criteria for this particular website is it has to be at least 8 characters long. So all the combinations that are less than 8 characters can be ignored. We can figure out, okay, this is the maximum length of characters based on trial and error or based on what it says. It's like, your password can be 8 to 24 characters long. Well, we know that any combination above 24 is not going to be allowed. So we start narrowing what we call the phase space of this particular possibility. If we say one character must be capitalized, one character must be lowercase, one character must be a number, and one character must be a special character, then we start limiting those possibilities yet again. Special characters, depending on what's allowed, may be less than half of the numbers I'm sorry, the letters available. The numbers, of course, we only have in a decimal counting system 10 possibilities. So if something has to be a number, then we take something that could be 70 different characters and reduce it to 10, which changes that multiplicative aspect of the bits of entropy quite a bit. So if we look at the actual mathematics of this, brute force attacks with a little bit of primer information actually are not as wasteful as people would think. Now, instead of breaking into a password directly, maybe we'll involve something like social engineering. So social engineering is just the process of using psychology to try and wheedle something out of another person, getting them to admit information, or to try and walk around potential security roadblocks. So this is an example of an actual social engineering attack that occurred. Social engineering attack that actually was carried out. I really want to try and find the source on this because I'd like to find a little bit more detail, but this is the structure that was given in the text that I had read. A group of people walk into the offices of a corporate institution of some kind, and they walk out with sensitive information. So they don't say what kind of company this is. It could be manufacturing, it could be accounting, it could be, multimedia, it doesn't matter. But they walk into these offices, these corporate offices, and walk out with some very sensitive information. They didn't use any kind of technical skills, they didn't use any tools. They just used a little bit of what some people would say is common sense. They go ahead and call the HR department, and they obtain some names of key employees. Now, this intrinsically is not necessarily bad, but in certain cases it may be if something is not considered to be publicly available information, if it is a business level of privacy or what we call a trade secret, we need to try and do a little bit of what's called obfuscation, which is just trying to conceal a little bit of that information. Now, I have a friend, I'm not going to say who it was, who worked for a company that did, just basic retail. And this person came in, was, huffing up a storm about all this problem, all these problems, and was definitely a, I need to speak to your manager kind of customer. And they were throwing a huge fit, and my friend was just like, okay, let's go ahead and get you hooked up with customer service. So he went and he grabbed this little binder from behind the desk, and he gave her the number, and she calls up and keeps claiming that it's not connecting, it's not the right information, blah, 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 blah. And my friend plops down the book and points at it and goes, look, this is the number right here, and holds his thumb by where the number is. What he didn't think about until much, much later, when his manager kind of chewed him a new corn shoot, was that there was a ton of contact information on there, going all the way up to the CEO of the company. This is a relatively small company, small franchise. So this person goes ahead and jots down a couple of those numbers into their phone, I guess in the notes or something else, under the pretext of trying to dial, and then leaves, still presumably in a huff because you can't, show any kind of relief or victory, and proceeds to start to, I guess, just rail these people's voicemail, trying to get some kind of, compensation or whatever else for some perceived slight. And of course, in retail, the rule always is, the stated rule anyway, the customer is always right. So people tend to bend over backwards to try and not get bad press. So of course, as I said, my friend got read the riot act by his boss at a later date. And it was just because he wasn't using good privacy practices to keep everything concealed. He wasn't using obfuscation to be like, all right, I'm going to write the number down for you. You can give them a call. It's the right number. I'm looking right at it. If you have any issues beyond that, I'm going to have you come back at another time and talk to a different person because clearly I'm not helping you in the right way, or something else. Things of that nature. And some people are just not big on nonconformity. Some people are very eager to please. So that kind of manipulation is very easy to do. So anyway, the group calls the HR department and gets several different key employees' names, just their names. The attacker comes in, pretends to have lost their key card, so that they're like, oh, I'm an employee just like you are, or I'm new, or maybe they claim that they had a meeting with this particular person and they worked at a different site. So they're trying to navigate a building with which they are not as familiar. And an employee, trying to be helpful, of course, held the door and let them in. The attacker then goes up to the CFO's office, getting a basic idea of the corporate structure of the building, possibly from an old policy manual or an old corporate directory, or just saying, hey, I'm supposed to be dropping something off for this person. Do you know where their office is? And people just trying to be helpful will throw that kind of information up fairly easily, because, again, they don't look at it as being anything of a security violation. It's these individual tidbits of information that in themselves do not seem valuable, but as part of a more consolidated whole are jigsaw pieces. And the more pieces you have, especially if you have some of the edge bits, it's easier to put the whole puzzle together. So again, this person finds the CFO's office. They tromp away and they get to where they need to be. They knew the CFO was absent from the voicemail greeting. I will be out of the office from such and such time to such and such time, which is something that should not necessarily be publicly advertised. So I guess either the door wasn't locked, or they found a way to kind of jimmy the lock with a credit card, or any number of things, and they got inside. Now, from this location, from the CFO's office, they called the company help desk, which I guess may have been something that they scored when they called HR, or they any number of things. Maybe it was something that was in a document that was in the desk. And they said, I need my password, I'm so-and-so, I'm in my office, blah, blah, blah. And the help desk agent goes ahead and either resets the password or gives it to them. And they then have complete access to the network as if they were this person who is in a very high office indeed. CFO, for those who don't know, is Chief Financial Officer. So this is somebody who is very much responsible for the day-to-day monetary transactions of the firm, making sure that everything's on the up and up. So that kind of impersonation is very important to try and avoid. Now, the main piece of information that a lot of people freak out about is like, well, why would the help desk agent just give out the password willy-nilly? And it's like, well, they used a minor piece of verification. The person pretending to be the CFO was calling from the office of that person. So being a rational individual, some people would be like, oh, CFO at his desk, very important person. I don't want to be the guy that tells the boss no, or somebody who is in a position of supervision or authority. So I'm going to be helpful. They're calling from the office, so it seems like everything's good. I'm going to go ahead and help them out. Not a good plan. So this, again, little bitty bits that build up together and make a much more potentially damaging situation. So social engineering, again, is it's using psychology. We're relying on various weaknesses of the human psyche in order to try and gather information. We're going to manipulate people by means of different methods of persuasion. We're going to use things like flattery. Ingratiation is the term they use in the book, just trying to make yourself in good graces with somebody, something that they would view you in a positive light, possibly be willing to be more trusting of you. Trying to use conformity, the idea that everybody is doing a particular thing or that it's not a big deal, blah, blah, blah. Friendliness, of course, especially if you look a little bit confused. If you come in and you're like, okay, hey, I'm new, I'm so-and-so, introduce yourself, using a false identity, of course, and then trying to kind of carry off this like, hey, man, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm new, I don't know where I am, can you tell me, I'm supposed to find these 3 people, blah, 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 and then you just go from there. Or I have a meeting with this person who you have conveniently made sure is not in the building at that time, or something else. And you try and gain the trust of your mark, of your punter or victim, just by means of this little bits of information. Now, the important thing here is to be aware that this is a very potentially risky situation for the attacker, because it involves person-to-person contact. You're not just trying to hack into somebody's bank account with this, faceless monolithic tool or something else that you're trying to get in with. You're actually trying to deal with a person who can read your body language, who has intuition about whether or not something just doesn't smell right. So you have to be careful as an attacker. You have to not ask for too much information at once. You also have to be aware that if people are asking seemingly innocuous questions, if you're a potential victim, that you're just kind of on your guard about why they might be asking that. Why that particular piece of information is something that A, they would want to know, and B, is it something that you need to be divulging. So the psychological approach is that the request has to be believable. We have to be able to deliver a request in a way that's just like, well, that would make sense. They would probably need to know that because blah, 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 whatever it is. Sometimes flattery will be used to gain cooperation, so these techniques will be combined. The idea is that you want to kind of figure out where the edge of the envelope is for that particular victim. Excuse me. You want to make sure you get the information that you need, but you want to make sure also that you're not seemingly arousing suspicion. You're not generating potential issues. Pretending to be confused, of course, can be a means of gathering information. Now, impersonation is a commonly used item where somebody creates a fictitious character playing a role to the victim, so somebody like a repair person, help desk technician, etc. You want to be careful, though, because you want to make sure that it's not something that seems blatantly obvious, that if this person is in this level of authority and they know nothing about what they're doing, that seems a little incongruous. It doesn't make sense. There was a guy that I read about several years ago who was in New York, very busy place, lots of businesses close to one another. And what he would do was he would get dressed up in a suit and would go to the main desk of a building and claim that he had a meeting with somebody in that building, but he needed to verify what floor, what office, whether or not he was in the right building, whether it was the right time, whatever else. And he had created a 1-800 number, a toll number at that point. And at the time, I think the maximum value per minute you could charge was something like $14 or $15. $15 a minute is pretty ridiculous, but for certain services, I guess that's available. And he would use the help desk phone, be like, hey, do you mind if I call this person, da, 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 and I've got this number. So they would go ahead and call it, wait for a period of time for it to ring. Of course, it would pick up. It was an automated thing, so maybe there was a timer or something that would go off in the person's ear, so that way they would know when 60 seconds had elapsed, so they had not only the first minute underway, but a little bit into the second minute. You mocked a phone call before, I'm sure, where it's just like, oh yes, okay. Oh, 45, not 46. Okay, let me go ahead and pop across the street. Sorry, let me go ahead and give this person back their phone. Okay, thank you, bye-bye. And they go ahead and hand the phone back, hang it up, it's all good. 2 minutes on the phone, maybe 2-3 minutes worth of work talking to the person before and after, if that's the case, and you've made $30. Now, depending on what time period we're talking, if it was in the late 90s or something like that, that's pretty decent money. The earlier it is, the more impressive it is. But if we're talking late 90s, early 2000s, that's not bad. It's not bad at all. So goes ahead and hangs up, leaves the building with a cheery wave and says, okay, thank you, sorry to have bothered you, and goes ahead and moves on to the next place. Just kind of out of sight. Maybe, they have a fairly generic appearance. Maybe they keep track of who's at what help desk. They go ahead and change into different suits. And the idea is that, there's so many phone calls going inbound and outbound on a particular building's, call list, that they're not necessarily concerned about, who called the toll number for blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, we'll go ahead and change that. And if that's the case, then they go ahead and, move the rules around, and somebody's like, okay, that site's blacklisted, I'm not going to go there anymore. But in Manhattan, of course, there's so many businesses that you can go ahead and move around. It's a little bit easier to try and conceal that kind of work. And if you're chipping, $15 to $30 every 2 to 10 minutes, you only have to do a couple hours in a day to be able to make some serious scratch. So that kind of stuff, impersonation, psychological approaches, very easy manipulations, small amounts of money on a relative scale. Those things are pretty easy to try and move around. People in positions of authority are often impersonated, even fictitious people, because people tend to resist saying no to a person in authority. Fictitious characters are also a good idea simply because if you try and impersonate somebody who is actually part of the business, the person that you're dealing with may know who they are, know what they look like, or may be that person. You know, I'm sure you've seen enough movies where somebody's like, oh yes, I'm Mr. So-and-so, or I'm Ms. So-and-so, and Ms. So-and-so comes walking down the hall as you're, you know, playing this role, and it's just like, oh crap, what do I do now? So that is a fairly common trope in media, but it has to come from a source somewhere. So we assume that that may well happen in real life. Some other things that we see for attempts to try and garner information would be things like phishing. Phishing is a very common social engineering attack. This is where we send fake emails. I always like the word bogus, so I try and include it where I can, claiming to be from a legitimate business. So we have a situation where, you know, somebody's trying to send you a kind of a fishy email from Verizon or PayPal or eBay or some other company that does a lot of online business, and they're like, oh, you know, your password has been compromised or expired, or we need to verify X amount of information about you, so please click on this link, enter your credentials, and verify your information, blah, 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 blah. That almost always, if you get something like that, tends to be just a big red flag. Anytime they ask you to click a link to launch the site, it's probably a redirect link. It's an imposter website. And because of how easy it is to steal, you know, graphics and web layouts and things like that, it's very difficult to be like, oh yes, this seems very unusual. There are 15 to 20,000 estimated new attacks launched every month. That is to say, in addition to the ones that are already out there. So there may be some that come into phase, come out of phase, you know, popularity. So it may or may not be something that is consistently maintained, but there are several thousand phishing attacks that come up all the time. There's always somebody who's willing to work assiduously for several days structuring a scam to make the kind of money they could have done doing a normal day's work in a single day. So it's interesting because, you know, once you've done it once, there's a supposition that being able to do it again would be somehow easier. There are variations, of course, on phishing. Things like farming. This is where we try and do phishing from other situations. Hang on a second, guys. Okay. Apparently my toddler decided it was time to start trying to paint the glass door to the porch. So that's a fun time. Anyway, so farming is essentially trying to harvest from multiple quote-unquote fishing sites at once. So this is where we try and break into an internet server that directs traffic. So routing servers, DNS servers, things like that, in order to try and produce lots of hits, trying to intercept traffic or generate revenue from multiple users simultaneously. Spear phishing is, rather than saying I'm going to go after any user, just go after, you know, cast a more broad net, if you will. I'm going to go after one particular user. Whaling, this is where we have attacks on wealthy individuals, so it's a specific form of spear phishing. And then we have what's called vishing, which is voice phishing. It uses the telephone, so it's you know, when people make these weird little scam calls, that would be called vishing instead. Hoaxes, these tend to try and drive people into making some sort of action without having real information behind it. So false warnings. Maybe there's a virus or some kind of change that needs to be made that instead of actually remediating a problem would cause some other vulnerability to become active. So you may get a combination of phishing and vishing at this point, to where you have an email warning and then maybe a follow-up that's done by a voice call to try and intervene. You may have a situation where there's like a ransomware where a screen pops up with a particular phone number that says, if you have this warning, this is a problem that you have, go ahead and call for help, things like that. Dumpster diving, this is where you have people digging through trash receptacles to try and find useful information. So things like calendars, memos, old USB drives, voided checks, bills, things like that. The target could be not only an individual, but an organization. Shoulder surfing is fairly common, where the information entered is observed by another person. So, if somebody's standing a little bit too close to you at the ATM, if somebody's, dropping off mail as they walk down an aisleway and they linger just a little bit too long, where it just happens to be that you're typing in your password. Fairly easy way to try and surveil information. So here are some dumpster diving items and their relative usefulness. As I said, calendars. These can reveal which employees are out of town at a particular time. Well-meaning as it is, people get custom calendars that have that kind of PI is stuff that people can use to try and construct password attacks. Things that might be considered a more viable option for somebody to use as a password. If they have a child who has a birthday on a particular day, then it's just like, oh, well, I need to make sure that that particular date is probably factored in. That's something they think about a lot. Inexpensive computer hardware, stuff that people wouldn't necessarily go through the correct channels to sanitize or recycle correctly. So again, flash drives, portable hard drives. Memos, just small bits of information that help to give an idea of the kind of processes that go on inside of an organization. If somebody's building an impersonation, being aware of these kinds of internal directives can be corroborative, much more convincing. Organizational charts that identify who is in a position of authority, somebody who may have a certain level of seniority or ability to access things who normally wouldn't need to. People who can break the what we call principle of least privilege. Phone directories, policy manuals. Policy manuals, of course, are very dangerous to have disposed of without correct destruction properties, things like that, because they can reveal the level of security within the organization directly. They can say, this is how we behave in the event of a crisis. This is the type of material that is going to be used. This is who is called in the event of an emergency. System manuals are likewise very dangerous because they can tell you what type of computer systems are being used, so that we can use other types of research to pinpoint vulnerabilities. We can find ways and means to try and break in stuff, if they're using a particular type of accounting software, or if they're using a particular type of network interface card that has a known vulnerability. Those things can be aggregated together to try and break in and steal more information. Tailgating. This is a physical procedure to try and break into a location. This occurs at restricted access points, holding the door open to allow multiple people to enter. It's problematic because we only have one point of authentication for two individuals. So that means that the second person that comes in does not necessarily have the correct credentials to get in where they are, but they're still inside. Identity theft, of course, as we talked about, using another person's personal information to commit fraud. Just to commit fraud not only in a fiscal way, but in a societal way, trying to manipulate people by impersonating things like that. Imagine if you got an email from somebody who was claiming to be your local, senator or House of Representatives member, things like that. That would probably carry a lot more weight than getting an email from some guy who put you on a random mailing list from trawling a website or, scrubbing Facebook or whatever else. So the identity theft is established. Somebody has gotten the correct information necessary to start committing this. They can do things like producing counterfeit checks, Counterfeit debit cards, reproducing magnetic stripe cards is a lot easier. Now, granted, in the modern era, using things like smart chips on cards and things like that, it's a little bit harder to carry out the same types of counterfeiting. But of course, as methods evolve, so do the methods of protection evolve. The methods of deceit will also improve. Establishing phone service, renting an apartment, filing for bankruptcy, purchasing big ticket items, and then opening up just lines of credit in general locations. And of course, the internet has made that a little bit harder to do, but there are, of course, ways around that. So, of course, dumpster diving, as we talked about, that's a way of getting personal information. Phishing, change of address forms, pretexting, and just straight out stealing. So not only could somebody go through a dumpster dive situation trying to get information about a company, they could find information somebody was discarding about their personal life as well. So we may see a target shift at that point. Or, of course, somebody may go on to the dark web or certain other instances and try and sell that information, even if they can't use it themselves, to try and turn a quick buck. Phishing, as we talked about, trying to get that personal information by means of interception or capture. Change of address forms. This was something that until I started teaching this course was not something that I was aware was quite so prevalent. This is where they divert mail from a standard location to a post office box so that if there's a line of credit created or things like that, the victim never sees anything that shows up. A legitimate research firm impersonation, somebody comes in through the process of pretexting, usually does cold calls or whatever else, trying to harvest information about, social engineering, things like that. This is actually something that I ran into. There were these young college-age kids while I was managing a video store who were concerned about, well, quote, concerned about the nature of increases in theft during the holiday season. And they brought up, what kind of security measures do you guys have in place? Immediate red flag. And it's just like, if you're curious about that kind of thing, I can go ahead and put you in touch with our corporate office, and they can redirect you to some different vendors. But that's not something I'm allowed to talk about at store level. So they seem kind of disappointed by that. But again, if somebody's aware of what type of security is in place, then of course it's easier for them to try and circumvent it, right? So you always have to be very aware of that sort of thing. And then, of course, your wallet, if you carry one, or a purse or other personal satchel of items, that can, of course, be rife with personal information that people could then use. Yes, Christian, you have a question.
Really quickly, I just wanted to bring up and ask about, did you get around to looking at the screenshots I sent with the lab?
Trying to think. I don't recall seeing them in my email. I will.
Oh yeah, sorry. I didn't send them in the email. I put them in the submission file.
Okay. I will double check those as soon as I'm done doing the lecture stuff for this one then.
Gotcha. No problem.
I guess I was looking for something that was not there.
No problem.
All right. Excellent. Always nice to be able to have an easy answer to a question. So, of course, these different methods are not considered to be, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some common ones. Now, a growing area of theft is filing fictitious tax returns. This is something that has come up quite a bit, and especially now that it is tax season. People are trying to be more proactive in making sure that their refunds are filed through secure means. If you go to somewhere like H&R Block, of course, they offer all sorts of protections because they're supposed to be handling your personal information in a particular way, a level of discretion and security. But the idea is that these false returns are not necessarily of false people. They're of people who would not necessarily file a return, maybe somebody who is deceased, a child, somebody who is intellectually disabled and considered a dependent, or maybe just filing the tax return of somebody who hasn't yet filed theirs and trying to circumvent where it's delivered. In 2011, the number was 1.5 million undetected false returns that were later picked up. And then, of course, as time has gone on, that number has varied, but tends to hold around the same even though they try and introduce things like PIN numbers and things like that. The reason that they don't seem to be making a whole lot of headway on the security is because the security thing is dependent on two sides. The institution that is providing the service has to create the security by some measure, but then of course the user on the opposite side has to be compliant. So if somebody uses a very poor password in terms of quality, if somebody gives out their password or leaves it in a place that could be easily accessible, or is not careful with the means of verification that somebody would use in order to put that kind of stuff out there, that means that compromise is a lot easier to pull off. So we see here just kind of a graphic talking about how identity theft happens. This is an extension of the previous slide. Some extra ones here: victim-assisted compromise, finding information via your friends or acquaintances. And then skimming, attaching a copier to the strip reader on a credit card machine. And these can be very, very small. Once the magnetic strip has been downloaded, it can be used to create a forged card. So, making a blank magnetic card is fairly easy. So what about the risks of social networking? Well, social networking is based on the idea of grouping together based on likes and dislikes, which means that if we know something about that person, it's easier to try and create a profile of what their behavior might be like, and then try and extend that to possibly falsifying things like passwords. We're going to link together individuals with common interests and create a user community which has a level of visibility. So if you're part of that social networking group, let's say you're on Twitter or Facebook or things like that, there are other users that have visible or semi-visible information that you could then use to kind of construct a profile of who they are, what their behavior is, what their likes and dislikes are. Now, because of the nature of social networking sites, there's a lot of personal data that's put out there. People use it as a platform to say whatever it is they feel they need to say on the internet. But of course, once it's digitized, it is, of course, forever. So once it's online, it's out there. So if somebody, mistypes something or, announces when their child was born and at what time and what their name is and all that other stuff, there are things that people can then use to try and create potential violations of security and trying to cause identity theft or other things. Users can often be too trusting. They can be involved with applications that take permission to access data that they have no reason to access, and then use that data for data mining, data sale, selling things like that. The whole Cambridge Analytica thing with Facebook a couple of years ago, that was a big one. The security on social networking sites is often very lax or confusing to access. It's very difficult to sometimes make the correct changes. Make the correct changes even if you're aware that they need to be made. And then, of course, in the interest of being social and trying to look as popular as possible, there is a problem with accepting friends that you don't actually know. Of course, public figures may have pages that can be managed, but some people just use their actual Facebook page, their personal Facebook page, to interact with people that they are only acquainted with, or maybe somebody is aware of a celebrity that has a public-facing Facebook page or something similar, or Twitter. So the consequence of this is that people who maybe should not be privy to certain types of information are then given access to it. So that can happen. So how do we defend against this? Well, we have to think like an attacker, which is why I've tried to describe a number of these different attack types as if we were speaking from the attacker's the attacker's point of view. So our defenses should be manifest in several different ways. Strong passwords, of course, we talked about trying to increase length and complexity, find ways to be able to memorize both. Then we'll talk about being able to preserve passwords in a more secure format as well. Recognizing a phishing attack, being able to identify where there are particular issues. Taking steps to avoid identity theft, making sure that we destroy sensitive information, things like that. And then securing social networking sites, if not avoiding them entirely. So, weak passwords, of course, do have some common characteristics, as we saw in the list before. They can often be memorized, and they are often reused where they should not be. There are online resources that we call password management tools. These are going to store and manage passwords securely, and this is essentially a password protected list of other passwords. So password management tools have several different characteristics that we may consider to be desirable. So things like in-memory protection, meaning that while the program is running and accessing this particular password or whatever it is, there's still some level of encryption or obfuscation that is keeping your password from becoming plain text in memory. So people couldn't do like a RAM dump or try and skim using an observant password manager tool. Somebody who's trying to be like, oh, this thing's running, let me go ahead and monitor the memory areas that are currently active. Key files, having to use an actual encrypted document or utility that has to run in order to verify you using something like an authenticator, fob, etc. You can lock them to a user account. You can do import and export in order to keep it safe on a particular device. But of course, the more copies you make of something, the less secure it is. Password groupings, this is where we take multiple passwords and kind of smush them together in a single entry, and then we parse them apart later on, so that way if somebody does try and steal information out of memory, they don't know where the beginning of one password is and where the end of the other is. And then of course a random password generator. Now random password generators are something we want to be very aware of, because the quote-unquote randomness of a system of this type is usually done through not necessarily what we would consider a truly random thing by,
Can I bring something up?
Oh, please. What do you have, Joseph?
So earlier when you were talking about like stuff that websites collect,
Uh-huh.
I thought about something that I remembered. When I was looking for an editing software, I came across this great thing called Wondershare Filmora, and I looked at their privacy policy as I was about to install it. And even though they're an editing software, it grabs a ton of stuff that makes absolutely no sense for them to have. Like name, gender, age, email address, country, postal code, phone number, company you work for, payment information. So, yeah, just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, what is that, Wondershare?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the crazy thing. Sometimes you'll notice that there are legitimate programs out there that carry out tasks that you're like, wow, why would anybody pay hundreds of dollars for Adobe Premiere when I could just get this? And it's like, $30, $40. Believe me, they're making their money on the back end if they're harvesting information about you, stuff that you agreed to because you didn't read the EULA.
Yeah. I used this thing for like 2 months called a theme scope, which was supposed to like capture gaming moments for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it really didn't do anything, and it never worked. And one day when I decided to uninstall it, I wanted to see how much Wi-Fi it used. It used more Wi-Fi data in 2 months than Destiny 2 had in 2 years.
Yeah, that's
31 gigabytes.
Unfortunately, that's not necessarily anything nefarious. It probably is, but it's not necessarily the case. It could just be that it's really poorly designed.
Yeah.
Constantly pinging something that it shouldn't be or whatever else. Just because something is badly made doesn't necessarily mean that it's malicious. It just means that it's crap.
I'm not saying it was malicious. I'm just saying it was
I know. I'm just
software.
saying it's kind of weird though, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people don't think about what these programs are capturing. So that is an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. Random password generators are not traditionally random. They use what's called a seed value, which is usually your system time, and then there's a couple of multiplication or other mathematical manipulations that go on to try and generate an unfeasibly large prime number, and then trying to generate a random value based on that. I don't want to be offensive to anybody, but I've definitely heard the term praying to RN Jesus. Whenever certain games rely on a random number generator,
Don't
The
insult my
idea
religion.
is that if you keep reloading it, or if you load it at a certain time or do certain activities, that can affect the random number generator to try and give you a more positive outcome.
In Destiny,
like
people say pray to RNGesus a lot because the game's entire drop system is RNG. One time, my friend got the most powerful gun 5 games in a row, and it took me 3 years to get it. So
yeah, again, it's just, that random number generator. If the seed is based on something that you've input, maybe the day that your account was created, or the length of characters in your account name, or the number of hours that you've spent, things like that will definitely occur. I mean, I had similar problems happen when I played World of Warcraft, and that was almost 20 years ago. So it's important to establish that these random number generator tools, depending on the equation that they're using, are not quite so random. There's a lot of people who try and figure out ways to manipulate those. There's a game that I play. I say play. It's more of kind of an idle game called Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms, and it's a bunch of D&D characters. And there's an achievement for a character they recently introduced, and the achievement was called Melf's Broken RNG. And the idea is that you would get a certain buff after, I think it's 200 zones in a row. So that would be, statistically speaking, very unlikely, considering the balance. But based on the RNG, it is entirely possible. So a little in-joke from Codename Entertainment on that one. That there are plenty of games that rely on seemingly random information. So how do these password management applications work? They fall into different categories. There could be a locally installed application that's installed just like it would be any other piece of software. Portable applications that are put onto bootable media or flash drives and can be used independently of an installation. And then there's internet-based systems that are entirely stored online. Now, of course, each of these have advantages and disadvantages, as you can see from the table. If you have an installed program, then that means that you have information directly on your machine. You don't have to memorize your passwords, and it's not something that's available online, provided that you don't have some kind of virus or anything else that would compromise that information. Now, if we use it on multiple computers, this can be problematic because that database file has to be present on each machine, and the original program has to be installed as well. If we have a portable application on something like a USB drive, we're not limited to the number of pre-installed computers, but we do have a problem with, if we don't have the flash drive with us, we can't use the application, and if we lose the flash drive, then somebody else could possibly take advantage of it. An internet storage-based system, something like LastPass, this is really handy for a lot of people because you can access it from any machine, and then you have storing passwords online, which means that they could theoretically be exposed, no matter how complex they are. Something that people will occasionally run into also is that using one of these by itself is not necessarily a great idea. You would usually want to combine it with something else. So maybe you have an installed application that has an online component, not necessarily meaning on the same device. Like if I have a password management piece of software on a laptop, and then I use an authenticator device on my phone, to where even if they have the password, they still have to have a particular code in order to access my account as well. That's just adding to the complexity of the security. When we talk about things like bits of entropy, you can essentially double the bits of entropy in certain cases by adding something like multi-factor authentication. So again, strong passwords really do rely on length. But that doesn't mean that you should just have like 20 instances of the lowercase letter a, just in a big string. You want to avoid dictionary words, phonetic words, the way things sound as well as how they're said, actually spelled. Personal information, repeating characters, repeating sequences. A minimum of 12 characters is recommended. Consider using a passphrase. I think there was a friend of mine who used, he would pick a particular book and use like the opening sentence as his passphrase, and then he would store it in LastPass, and then he had a master password he would use for all the other stuff. But I mean, like, these passwords were something like 115 to 130 characters long on average. So again, that complexity gets really, really nuts. Non-standard characters using like alt combinations. Now, not all applications can accept these, but these can add complexity in a surprisingly short amount of time. Now, this does not make you immune to things like keyloggers. So, just be aware that, again, it's not necessarily a perfect system. So recognizing a phishing attack means that we have to be aware of the common traits of the phishing email. Official logos, web links, the sense of an urgent request. There's a lot of phrasing that's in there. If there's misspellings and things that shouldn't be wrong that are, that should always be a red flag. I will say, trusting your gut and being overly suspicious tends to protect you more often than it tends to hurt you. So if you're in a situation where you're not sure if something seems unusual, what I would do at that point is, don't do anything else in the email, but go to a different browser window and then open up, like, again, let's say it's eBay. Instead of clicking on the link, just go to www.ebay.com, which is the secure address, log into your account and see if something comes up in the messages. Most companies will say, we will never contact you asking for your password or anything like that. We'll notify you that there is a message in your inbox and that you should go to the normal website and locate it via that. Which is a good idea, because these companies do suffer a lot of damage to their reputation if there's a successful phishing email out there. So 2 basic steps for avoiding identity theft. We want to make sure we're safeguarding our information, and we want to make sure that any financial statements and accounts that we have the ability to monitor on the regular, that we do. So any financial documents that you receive that are physical, we should shred after a given period of time. Avoid carrying your Social Security card in your wallet, and do not laminate it. Apparently that's a big issue. Secure personal information at home. Make sure that it is in a secure location, somewhere that you know where it is, but other people do not. And again, check on it from time to time. Make sure people haven't been going and digging. Don't provide any personal information over the phone or via email. My mom told me something when I was a kid that stuck with me for a very long time. Never say anything you don't want someone else to hear. Never write down something you don't want someone else to read. So if you are concerned about sharing a particular piece of personal information, you want to make sure that it is provided through as secure a channel as possible. Make sure that if you're monitoring your accounts, you know what unusual activity looks like. Do you have issues with, there's a charge that you don't understand, or there's a payment that you don't recognize. There can even be times where there are situations where it might not necessarily be a quote-unquote negative thing that goes on. So avoiding identity theft also kind of ties into legislation. There are things that can help you to monitor your financial information. I go through Credit Karma personally. I think they're a pretty helpful site, but then there's also things that are included through your bank that you might get, or if you have a certain credit card, your FICO score may be reported consistently, and then you can keep an eye on it that way. A lot of this was brought about in 2003 through what was called FACTA, the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act. This is basically allowing you free annual access to your full credit report, but again, only periodic monitoring doesn't really qualify. So if you see a change in your score, that's not the same thing as actually pulling your full report, which you can do depending on the service. Consumers can report inaccuracies, and rather than the burden being on them to investigate and respond, the agency will have to do that. So the burden of proof is on whoever's reporting that information. So let's say that you have an account with, who does all the store cards? Synchrony Bank. Synchrony is, giving you issues because, they say, well, you missed a payment, last year, and we're going to go ahead and report that as blah, blah, blah. And you go back and you're like, no, there's a debit coming out of my account every month for this thing. And you go back and you make a dispute to the credit agencies. They go ahead and investigate it. You submit your evidence. Synchrony submits theirs, and they find that you were in fact correct. They will then have to go in and change your credit report to reflect that you were in fact making consistent on-time payments. So instead of putting a financial burden on people who may already be at a disadvantage, they put the burden on the company to verify their claims. With social networking, let's go ahead and be cautious about what we post. If you post travel plans, if you know anybody that's on your Facebook or Twitter feed who is very much in that whole, eat, pray, love. I'm taking a gap year. My dad said he'd pay for me to go to Italy for 6 months or something else. That's cool. That's awesome for them. Go out and explore. You see your country with new eyes when you get home, I hope. But while you're out of the country or out of town or out of your mind, whatever it is, your burglary risk becomes alarmingly high. It's like, oh, this person's not going to be home? Sweet. I'm going to go crack open their back window and steal all their stuff. Consider that not only your friends can read the post, but your boss, your mother, that really sketchy guy on the back of the bus. All of these people have potential to be able to read this post. So just post carefully. Consider that if you have business associates or acquaintances, that you have a limited version of your profile that controls certain types of posts that may be present. There's a lot of companies that will actually hire private investigators and other groups to try and look at the social media profiles of people that they intend to hire. So there'll be somebody who, adds your information on. It's like, hey, I ran into you at so-and-so's party last week. You seem like a pretty chill dude. We can, talk about The Witcher or whatever else and blah, blah, blah. And people are like, oh, yeah, that's cool. I don't want to be rude. Again, conformity. I don't want to be rude. And then all of a sudden this person has access to viewing all of your materials if you don't have any kind of controls over what is or isn't posted to a particular group of people. Be aware that if there are new security settings, which companies always do a really poor job of notifying you of, that you try and stay on top of keeping those updates current, so that way you're not left exposed in the event of a major change. One of the big ones that I like to warn my students about, because they're not necessarily aware of that, is if you have a credit card, or if your parents do, you can pass this on to them as well, and they get this really thin envelope. It's almost like when you get your car registration back, and it's got the perforated sides, and it's really flimsy, and you have to it's like a puzzle box trying to get the darn thing open. Then you unfold it, and it's a bunch of really tightly packed lettering, and it doesn't really say anything that you can recognize. That's usually the privacy agreement for that particular financial institution. It could be your bank, it could be a credit card, it could be student loans, anything like that. That's where you get this security that they are by law required to notify you about, but they don't have to make it easy to read, and they don't have to make it prominent what it actually is when you get it. So just be aware that if you get something from an institution like that, even if it's not like this is an attempt to collect a debt, it could be something that's important for you. So just make sure that you're being aware of what you're being sent, so that you don't accidentally throw something away that would be important for you to know about. A really good tactic that a lot of people are choosing to get into now is disabling everything and then only turning on stuff when you need it. So an example of this that you might see in a little bit more of a hand-holding kind of sense is in Windows. If you're setting up a new system, you'll notice that things pop up all the time asking if you want to allow something through the firewall on public or private networks, etc. So if it's a program you don't recognize, you're like, no, I don't want to allow access to this. What is this? And then maybe you'll be like, oh, this is a Windows feature. I do need to go ahead and allow it, blah, blah, blah. And you can make those variations after you're informed. And I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of people forget about, is that it's not necessarily the case that you need to understand everything that's going on your machine, but you do need to be informed. You need to be aware of, is this dangerous? Is this potentially actionable in some way? So that's a really handy way to go about it. Be like, okay, now I'm informed at least as to whether or not this is from a legitimate source. This is something from Microsoft, or this is something from Apple, this is something from Adobe, whatever program I'm using. So these are some different features that Facebook has in particular, and this was as of 2014, so this was a little while ago. But it's just some risks that are attached. So games and applications, of course, they can capture information. As Joseph said a little bit ago, something that's supposed to help you capture video so that you can post it on social media or things like that could be harvesting information well beyond what would be considered necessary for its operation. Social advertisements, of course, your ads are reflective of what you do. And something I didn't know, every fourth post on your news feed in the current Facebook iteration is an ad. So you can count 1, 2, 3, 4 ad and keep going from there. Your name and Facebook profile picture appear in the places list, which is visible to anyone who checks in the same location, even if they're not a friend. So if you go up to Charlotte and you go to the Uptown Amphitheater and you're checking in for a concert, Anybody who is at that same location checking in at the same time may be able to see you, even if they have no idea who you are. So there's some weird, stalky stuff that can go on at that point. A web search, there's stuff that, if you haven't Googled yourself, I definitely recommend you do it, because you'd be surprised at what's available there. And again, I mean, some of it's hidden behind a paywall, some of it is just stuff that's public records, but there's a lot of information that's out there. And if you have your real name on your Twitter account or your DeviantArt profile or your Tumblr or whatever different social media things you're part of, then of course that information could then be crawled by a what's called a web robot, which then takes that information, puts it as part of the index, and then makes it easily searchable. And then lastly, of course, photo albums. Photos can be set to private, but photo albums also have to be set to private individually. So you have to make sure, again, going through the labyrinthine BS of Facebook privacy settings and Twitter privacy settings and all that stuff can be a real challenge. But it's important that you do so, because you don't want all of your personal information just be out there. There's something that a lot of people don't think about when you're looking at free web services, and that is if you are taking advantage of something that costs money, especially if the company like Facebook is worth billions of dollars, or was at one point. If you're not paying for it, somebody is. So that means that you are not the customer, you're the product. Your information is being collected, aggregated, and sold. Somebody's making money somewhere, and it sure as shoot ain't you. So you always want to be aware of what information am I giving up for free. If this is considered something valuable, I want to protect it. I want it to be visible to people that I know and want to see it, but people that I don't want to see it, I want to go ahead and block that off. Companies like Google. A lot of people think of Google as being this big monolithic thing, and that's not necessarily the case. Google is a collection of different divisions of research and design and service providing for search engines, things like that. But they are not the top of the heap. They are owned by a parent company called Alphabet. And Alphabet is a little bit more shadowy in the stuff that they do, and the stuff that they may be found to do later on will likely be built on the back of your personal information. So just be aware that every Google search, every image search, everything that you do is being recorded and aggregated in some capacity. So just make sure that you're aware of the cost of these free services, and that's trading privacy. We can see here that your profile status, there's no control over who joins a network, so you want to make sure that if you have something available to your friends, it's only available to your friends. Pretty much anything on here except for the online status should be available to only your friends at minimum. Your online status, saying that you're on or off, any benefits derived by knowing who is online is immediately outweighed by the risks. So just be aware that, again, things that are visible to people outside of your sphere of influence could be used for any purpose, positive or negative. So that is Chapter 2 in the security lecture. Does anybody have